Thank you, Marcus. It's a pleasure to be in Bonn again, or slightly more honestly, it would be a pleasure to be in Bonn again if I were feeling better. I think one of the 4 or 5 medicines I just took to try to resurrect myself, I think might have contained some kind of sleeping element. I'm feeling very groggy, so I'm hoping adrenaline is about to kick in. Is there a microphone? That might help me. I'm speaking into a microphone. That's a microphone. Can you hear me? Oh, okay. Well, if I go below the audible threshold, will you raise your hand? Okay. Thanks very much for the invitation, Marcus. As Marcus, I guess, sort of was intimating, this talk is drawn from a larger body of work that I've been banging my head on for a while now, and some of you have heard installments from this project. And many of those installments are more interesting than what you'll hear today because they involve more ambitious claims. What I'm really going to try to do in today's talk is not get very far into the heart of the project, but clarify something about the initial point of departure in the project, which I find often is misunderstood and leads to certain questions which make what come next pointless. So see if I can get this clear, at least to my own satisfaction, maybe to yours. So I'm going to start, there's a handout. Does everyone have a handout? Okay, so I'm going to start with an example from Thomson Clark, which is actually courtesy of Arata Hamawaki, Japanese-American philosopher who was in a class of Thomson Clark's many years ago. He published very little, but taught famous and interesting classes on skepticism. And this is an example from one of Clark's classes as recounted by Hamawaki. So let's just work through the example first. So I'm going to ask you to imagine that early in the last century, sometime before the First World War, a small plane crashes somewhere in the remote regions of the Sahara. Among the charred remains of the crash is a copy of Bertrand Russell's The Problems of Philosophy. So we had quite a literate pilot here. And all of the pages of that book have been destroyed, except for just a sentence and a half of charred remains. And there we have, remaining in this little fragment of Bertrand Russell, the following words in the deep Sahara, ... What we would like to know is whether there are really tables and chairs. Do tables and chairs really exist? Now, some local nomads come upon the crash site, and they're intrigued by these legible remains of Russell's work, and they somehow manage to find a fellow native who can serve as a translator, who knows some English, and who's able, to some extent, to render those words into their own tongue. They are puzzled. They ask the translator, what is it about which those sentences speak? What in the world are tables and chairs? What are those words supposed to refer to? The translator does his best. He's read some things. He's never been out of the Sahara himself, but the deep Sahara. But he offers a description of roughly what he believes they're reputed to be. He confesses that never having set eyes on a table or a chair himself, and not being in possession of any direct evidence that testifies to their existence, he himself is uncertain that they truly exist, but he has an idea roughly what they are. He admits that they could well be like those mythical creatures that are mentioned in the nomadic legends, but many suspect aren't truly real. Upon hearing this, the nomads feel a sudden kinship with the author who penned the words whose meaning they've been trying to puzzle out. They think he's asking some version of the very question that we ourselves want to ask when we discuss the things that are mentioned in the legends. That's the end of the example from Thomson Clark. It's typical of several other examples of his, if you know his paper, The Legacy of Skepticism. I take it the thought he's trying to motivate here goes something like this. Bertrand Russell, when he wrote those lines in The Problems of Philosophy, was not just asking the same question the nomads want to ask. Yet, and this is the point that will matter for my talk today, both Russell and the nomads articulate their respective questions using the very same words. They both put what they want to know by asking, do tables and chairs exist? But Russell understands his question, as Clarke will put it, philosophically. And the nomads understand their question, as Clarke puts it, plainly. Yet their respective questions may be expressed through the very same words, or through, as Clarke calls them, a pair of verbal twins. The nomads, anxious to get an answer to their question, were to send out one of their own on an exploratory mission to Cambridge, England. What their intrepid explorer might report back, having visited there, would not provide an answer to Russell's question, as Russell originally understood it. Indeed, as Hamawaki points out in motivating the thought I just tried to explain, Russell himself might have answered the nomad's question for them. And if he did so, he might well use the very same words that, under different circumstances, would express a positive answer to his question in the problems of philosophy, without thinking that he had thereby answered his own question. Hamawaki illustrates that point in the following way. Imagine Russell receives a telegram from the nomads. They somehow get far enough north to be able to send off one of these things they hear about. And they ask him in the telegram if he could settle their question for them. Do you, Professor Russell, have tables and chairs in Cambridge, England? These poor, ignorant natives, Russell thinks to himself, and he immediately cables back. Yes, there indeed are such things as tables and chairs here in Cambridge. Do you want me to send you some? How many of each would you like? In the meantime, while waiting to hear back from them, Russell can return to pondering with his tutorial students what Clarke calls the verbal twin of the nomad's question. Turning to his students, Russell can now say, okay, I got that telegram off. Now, are there really such things as tables and chairs? Now, it might be said by someone that the philosopher here wants to know not just whether there are tables and chairs, but whether, as this person might want to put it, there are really tables and chairs. Whether there are tables and chairs in the world as it really is. So, this person might think, there are a few individual words that we can just interpolate here that will serve easily to disambiguate the verbal twins. The proposal under examination is that the word really is such a word. That's how you distinguish the philosophical question from the other one. Or more precisely, the proposal is this, that where it occurs, or maybe not just occurs, but where it occurs in a certain way, said sufficiently emphatically. Our concern now is with the general distinction between appearance and reality, and that shows that we have broached philosophical ground. When it occurs in a certain way, but in what sort of way is that? After all, couldn't the nomads put their question in the same way? With something like the same degree of emphasis? Something like the same insistent tone of voice as the philosopher? After all, they too want to know whether there are really tables and chairs, or whether there are tables and chairs in the world, as it really is. The tendency behind the proposal I just canvassed is to think that the implaned question and the philosophical question can be distinguished by distinguishing something I will just roughly call for a moment the subject matter of their respective questions. The implaned question on this way of thinking is just about some bit of reality, while the philosophical question is about the whole of reality, say. Or alternatively, the implaned question is about some particular case or some whole class of middle-sized dry goods, whereas the philosophical question is about something we're inclined to call the possibility of material objects as such, and knowledge of them. But what is involved in coming to master the relevant sort of use of an expression such as material objects as such? This talk wants to propose the following suggestion, that the difference we need to understand here is not a difference in the subject matter, something we can think of as simply the subject matter of the two questions, but in the form of problematic, or as the Germans can nicely say, Fragestellung, in which they each issue. It is through this that we try to make of them the sorts of sense that we do. And I use the terms form and matter partly because they naturally invite a question, as they have from Aristotle through Hegel at least, of what the relation between form and matter is, and to what extent each can be individuated, independently of the other. I am going to present this talk in such a way that I will remain neutral on that question. But it's ultimately one of the questions that really interests me here, and those of you who know other work of mine will know that I'm not neutral about this, and you'll even know which way I lean. But first, let's just, as it were, explore how that which we might be inclined to call form and that which we might be inclined to call matter here might be related, while leaving the question open. As I read Thomson Clark, one way, this is not his way of putting things, but one way of putting the point of what he wishes us to come to see about what separates the two different uses of the very same words that Russell and the nomads each call upon in asking their respective questions is that the entire form of the investigation which ensues is different. Then an answer to the one does not compete with an answer to another, as Clark himself puts it. Clark is interested in characterizing the differences between a pair of verbal twins where one of them is, as he puts it, plain, and one of them is philosophical. In today's talk, I'll be interested in exploring the differences between a pair of philosophical twins, between a pair of twins in which both of the siblings are philosophical. But I think there is a relation between the issues that interest Clark and those that interest me. In his Dewey lectures, Hilary Putnam says the central skeptical question that contemporary philosophy must address is the following. Quote, can our cognitive powers reach all the way to the objects themselves? Unquote. In his Locke lectures at one point, John McDowell says the central skeptical question that contemporary philosophy ought to address and is trying to address in the works that interest him, in Sellers, Brandon, others, Davidson, is the following. Quote, can our cognitive powers reach all the way to the objects themselves? Unquote. Here too, I will argue, and in fact I think I won't argue this much in the talk itself, for not unrelated reasons. We have a pair of verbal twins. In the case of the Putnam-McDowell twins, if I may call them that, both siblings are, as I said, philosophical questions, each representing what I will call a different form of philosophical skepticism. But as with twins, they can be hard to distinguish at a difference because they can appear very similar. To say that each involves a different form of skepticism will, again, mean that we cannot adequately distinguish them if we try to do so by saying simply how their subject matter differs, or saying a particular word or couple of words occurs in the formulation of the question. For example, by trying to say something like this is how my point has often been summarized. And so it's this summary that of my work that I'm trying to head off in this talk, of the beginning of my project. Oh, Conant's point is something like Putnam's skepticism is about truth. That's its subject matter. Whereas McDowell's is a different kind of skepticism. It's about content. That's its subject matter. As if the first had nothing to do with content and the second had nothing to do with truth. I do think there's something right in that underlying thought there if we can get it clear. But I think we can only get that clear if we achieve an appreciation of how these skeptical worries differ with regard to their form. That's what that has to be shorthand for. For the purpose of this talk, I will want to distinguish between just two different forms of philosophical skepticism, as well as between the related forms of philosophical response those skepticisms have engendered. And I will call the entire dialectic, both the skeptical question and the responses that ensues in each case, a form of skepticism. Not because I think there are only two forms, but let's just see what it would be to distinguish some forms at all. So I'll try to distinguish two. maybe I'll say just in passing, to seed a question discussion, if you like, I don't think either of these forms can be found in ancient skepticism. Not because the ancients aren't concerned with something we should genuinely call skepticism, but because I think we can see the form of the problematic there to be different in ways that matter to me, if we look closely enough. Which is not to say that you can't find the very same words stating a question, which we can take to be the same question, if, as it were, identity of verbal twins gives you, where there's indiscernibility of identity at that level, there's identity of skeptical problematic. So the aim of this initial taxonomic exercise of just distinguishing two forms is to furnish a perspicuous overview of at least a few of the dialectical relations obtaining across a range of at least some problems that philosophers in the last couple of hundred years have called and continue to call skeptical. So my original basis for calling them skeptical, if you will, is sociological. People have called both of these kinds of issues skeptical problems. I think getting an overview of how they relate to each other can afford a number of forms of philosophical insight. I'm only going to be concerned with two in the talk, but we could talk about others in the discussion if you like. Now, in other work of mine, I've given different labels for the different forms of forms of skepticism I've distinguished, and the two I'll be talking about in a moment in trying to distinguish qua forms, I have called in other work Cartesian skepticism and Kantian skepticism, respectively. I see Marcos nodding. And I found that invites all sorts of heated discussions about the merits of these labels and the details of my Descartes reading and the details of my Kant reading. All discussions in other contexts it was very much part of my aim to elicit. And if you want to talk about that in the discussion, I guess we can. But today, I'm going to at least try to place the focus not so much on questions of the respective historical provenance of these questions, and when one can first see them fully with respect to the form I want to claim for each, coming on the historical scene with all of their features clearly manifesting themselves. But rather, I just want to look at them each with regard to their form and see how they differ and do not differ with respect to each other. I want to just try to keep it at that level. So partly maybe to try to slightly dampen the tendency to fall into historical exegetical controversy immediately. For the sake of this talk, I'll just call them the first form of skepticism and the second form of skepticism. And if first and second seems to involve some kind of deep philosophical claim to you too, then think of them as skepticism A and skepticism B. And if the structure of the alphabet still is causing trouble there, call them skepticism Bluck and skepticism Bluck. Call them whatever you want. I'm just interested in two forms here. There's lots of other things I want to say about them, but right now let's just get them in view as forms. So I will say first and second, but even in so labeling them, for the purpose of the talk, the only sense in which I'm claiming the first of these is in any interesting sense first is that it happens to come first in the order of exposition of today's talk, and similarly for the second. Just to be clear, I do think there are interesting things to be said, and these things interest me, about the relations of relative priority or mutual logical dependence between these two forms of skepticism, and about the relation between each of these and other forms of skepticism I won't discuss in the body of the talk itself. And if you're dying to know more about that, in the discussion, we can take that up if you like. But nothing in the body of the talk should be understood as itself containing such a claim, as far as I can tell. Though it's hard to eliminate all of one's assumptions from paper in trying to proceed slowly and neutrally. So maybe I deceived myself. Okay. So, according to, as I said, to the unconventional idiom I'm employing here, the term skepticism and the various variants I've used in the past, Cartesian and Kantian, or for today's talk, first form of skepticism, second form, each of these ways of speaking, the term skepticism will refer not just to a particular sort of philosophical position. It's not a thesis or a doctrine held, say, by one or another sort of skeptic, but rather it refers to what we might call the wider dialectical space within which philosophers occupy a range of apparently opposed philosophical positions. Some famous names for such positions are, though I don't think these are the only names, realism, idealism, coherentism, and so forth. So a range of philosophical positions in a space through which philosophers engage one another, while, in most cases, seeking a stable way to answer the skeptic's question in the affirmative by saying how we can, do what the skeptic perhaps suggests we can't. Answer in the affirmative, rather than as the skeptic himself does in the negative. So if this is right, and if you want, we can take this up too in the discussion, it should be possible to distinguish between a first and a second sense of a term, like, say, realism, and a first and a second sense of a term such as idealism. Indeed, I'd argue, for example, that Berkeley is concerned with an idealism of the first form, and Hegel with one of the second form, and so forth. But the simpler point for the moment, for the talk, is just this. According to the terminology I'm introducing, a philosopher can be concerned with, fully entangled in, say, the first form of skeptical problematic, as Descartes and Russell each were, without either of them themselves being a skeptic. The following is an excerpt from the classic formulation of the first form skeptical problematic. We're now in your handout, quotation Roman 2, number 1. I won't read it out. I'm going to try to save my voice as much as I can. But it's a famous passage. We might try to, maybe I'll just try to perform it for you in the first person. Here I am, lecturing to an audience of people. It seems like a best case of knowledge. For all the world, that's what I'm doing. But I was lying in my bed, very dizzy, in the Hotel Bristol just a few moments ago, dozing off. Perhaps, in a fit of wish fulfillment, I am dreaming that I managed to make it to my lecture, and I'm telling you about the first form of skepticism. There are no marks and features that decisively distinguish from within whether, if I were having such a vivid dream in my bed in the Hotel Bristol, as opposed to standing before you in the Festsaal right now, that would allow me to distinguish the one from the other, the veridical from the non-veridical case, as is sometimes said here. Thus, there are no marks and features. There's no way to eliminate the question. If these two scenarios are, in that sense, indistinguishable from the subject position, then there's no way to eliminate the question. It's possible that I am lying in bed dreaming. If that's true, then I cannot be said to know that I am, and so forth. I wish to contrast that skeptical problematic, which figures in a different version in the above passage with a sleeping gown and a fireplace and so on, with the one which is in the offing in the following excerpt from Kant. Again, I won't read the whole thing out. It's a passage in which he's discussing the categories, the conditions of the unity of experience, and asking what would be the case if there was no such unity, if there were no such conditions of unity. And then he says, what would be met with in the manifold of Vorstellungen is such that they would not then belong to any experience, consequently would be without an object, merely a blind play of Vorstellungen, less even than a dream, unquote. So the problematic of the first of these passages centers on how to distinguish two cases that are supposedly indistinguishable. And there are different ways of generating such indistinguishability. The way Descartes does it is with dreaming. A.J. Ayer prefers bent sticks. Hilary Putnam prefers brains in a vat. What matters is, as it were, not how one motivates the problematic, but the form of it, the form in which it's motivated, and the form one claims for the relation between the two scenarios thus generated. And where one is indistinguishable from experiencing something, in the other case, I am genuinely experiencing that. Whereas the second of these two problematics, the one at issue in the Kant passage, focuses on the conditions of the possibility of something that the first problematic takes for granted. How shall we put this difference? A familiar way of putting the difference is to say that the first is just concerned with knowledge, whereas the second is concerned with the conditions of knowledge. It's one of these ways of putting things I don't find very helpful. But When you're told something like that, then it's usually spelled out like this. Well, the first sort of philosopher, he wants to arrive at knowledge. Second sort wants to arrive at the ground of the possibility of knowledge, as if one couldn't find those words in Russell or Descartes. So what does that come to? What is it to understand the words ground of possibility in the way that really ties up to the second, as I'm calling it, form of skepticism? There are a lot of ways of unpacking that contrast. I'll briefly indicate a few of the different points on which the accent can fall in trying to unpack it in the work of various philosophers. I think there's something to be said for each of these. But in the end, I would want to claim that these apparently distinct formulations have to be seen to come to the same thing. And to see that is a matter of seeing what I'm calling the difference in form between the two cases. So here's the first of three ways you might go about unpacking the contrast. To say, in the first case we're concerned with actuality rather than possibility. Now, I don't think it can be that one of these words occurs emphatically rather than the other, but the idea might be something like this. The first form of skepticism takes something we're going to call here the possibility of experience for granted. Its question has to do with actuality. Thus, as we have seen already from our Thomson-Clarke example, the tendency for there to be an emphatic use of the word real in formulations of the second problematic. Are things really as they seem? Whereas the second form of skepticism brings within the scope of its worry that which the first form is here assuming is unproblematically available. That experience possesses, as Kant called in his passage, a certain kind of unity, that it so much as appears to be of an object. The requisite unity to be even putatively about something. Hence the importance of the word possible with a certain emphasis in formulations of the latter problematic. How is experience so much as possible? Or to bring the point even more audibly to light in a way that I think starts to bring out the difference, how could our experiences even so much as be false? Second way of putting the difference, I take this one from Stanley Cavell, a difference between the emphasis being on things being so and an emphasis on things being so. Same words, but heard a little differently. On this way of trying to put the issue, the form of skepticism in Clarke's example is one that turns on the veridicality of the experience, whereas in the second form of skepticism, Cavell will call this a matter of Wittgensteinian criteria, the question has to do with the intelligibility of experience. The first is concerned with the question, how can I know that things are as they seem, where the worry has to do with the inferential step from something we then tend to call appearance to reality. Where in the second case, things turn on the question, how can we even infer from what we there infer from? How can things even in that sense so much as seem to be a certain way? Hence the worry, in the latter case, focuses on the conditions, as we saw Kant saying, of the possibility of the kind of unity presupposed in the very idea of experience, even in supposedly very thin human experience. What are the conditions of its possibility? Such that we even have, as Hume calls it, merely associative unity. What sort of unity must characterize a play of presentations for it to be more than a merely blind play, for it to possess the aspect of offering appearances, for it to possess the character of being, in this sense, of an object? Third way of trying to pull the verbal twins apart, to try to get us to hear the same words differently, depending upon which form of skepticism is at issue. We might call this a contrast that turns on the difference between truth, on the one hand, an emphasis on something that gets called truth, as opposed to what John McDowell, for instance, will call objective purport. So this way of trying to get the difference will go something like this. A skeptic of the sort that Clarke is concerned with wants to know which of his thoughts are true, which of his experiences are veridical, and so whether he's really dreaming. This skeptic, therefore, worries about a transition from sensory experience to judgment, from a thought to what Frege calls its truth value, where being able to enjoy a thought is understood to be an exercise of our cognitive capacities that's logically independent and prior to judging. And then in a further step, we judge. And then the question is, how do we know when we've taken this step without undertaking too much risk? Hence, this sort of skeptic sees this task as starting with the task of ensuring the step from thought to judgment. And in doing so, separating out the cases when we judge truly from those when we judge falsely. Given that this is what we are inclined to judge, do we know that we judge truthfully in so judging? Whereas in the second form of skepticism, it no longer seems as if we could start there. The second worry ends up depriving us of the resources for so much as being able to enjoy experience, waking or dreaming, for so much as being able to frame a thought, a candidate for truth or falsity. Thus, the latter sort of form of skepticism ends up focusing on what then gets called the grounds of the possibility of being able to do things like enjoy an experience, entertain a thought content, where we find the latter sort of skeptic pressing the question, what does it take to have thoughts that are so much as vulnerable to how things are? Where the problematic, you might say, is concerned in the first instance, not with truth, even though eventually truth is very much the issue. But in the first instance, the question will be, what is it to so much as stick your neck out in thinking? And how is the exercise of this capacity related to the thing we're inclined to call mere thinking in the first sort of skepticism? It's concerned with what Kant calls die objektive Gültigkeit der Urteilskraft, the objective validity of judgment. What John McDowell, as I said, calls the objective purport of our cognitive capacities. Now, here's a sociological claim. At this point in the history of philosophy, I think this has only been true for a few decades, but at this point in the history of philosophy, in most areas in which you find one of these two forms of skepticism, you can also find literature generally that's concerned with the other form. As I said, that's a sociological claim. It's worth distinguishing from the following philosophical claim. Wherever one of these forms of skepticism is possible, the other is also possible. If that's true, it'd be nice to have a better understanding of why it's true. Is it just the direction that fashion is going in, say, contemporary analytic philosophy? The real aim of the larger manuscript from which this is drawn is try to illuminate questions of that sort. In this talk, I'm going to focus on something preliminary to that task, namely clarifying what it means to distinguish varieties of skepticism in the manner that I'm attempting to do, in virtue of their form. To this end, I will now briefly indicate a few of the guises in which the two aforementioned forms surface across a number of supposedly distinct areas of philosophy. This also raises a further question we could take up in discussion if you want. What is an area of philosophy? And what is it actually to individuate philosophy in terms of things we should call areas? But I'll just leave that hanging there as a question now. So what you have on your handout, I should say at this point, the handout in no sense, I don't know it's really been doing this so far either, but from now on, it in no sense illustrates what I say. It rather supplements it. So the handout goes one way, and I'll go the other way. What the handout does is it distinguishes skepticisms in relation to how their form bears on their matter in the following way. In Roman 3 of the handout, if you want to talk this way for the moment, keep the form fixed and vary the matter in 5 different ways, giving you 5 variants of the first form. In Roman 4 of the handout, in the next part of the handout, I give you 5 variants of the second form. Doing things in the way the handout does allows one to see more clearly how the same form, or what we might want to call the same form, is at issue across what we might at first be inclined to call different sorts of matter, leaving open how matter and form are related here, as I said. So in the talk, I will proceed in the opposite way. I will alternate back and forth between discussions of the first and second form with respect to something that is often called, in at least contemporary analytic philosophy, the same topic or the same area, same subject matter. Doing it this way allows you to see more clearly at least how the forms differ from one another. It allows us, as I said, to pull apart the verbal twins, despite the fact that they can be expressed through the same words. Now, I think ideally, in order to get a proper handle on what I want to call form and matter here and how they're related, we want to develop the topic in both of these ways at once, but time is too short for that. So, one way in the handout, another way in the talk. Let's start with philosophy of perception, if you think that is an area of philosophy. I think this is the most classic instance of each of these varieties of skeptical problematic. And indeed, if we took up completely other forms of skepticism, for instance, Pyrrhonian skepticism, I think some question in the philosophy of perception would be the most classic form of that. So there's an interesting further question here. Why is it when one of these forms is unfolded and comes in the scene, we get clear about it? Philosophy of perception is where it often starts, and where we always have the least controversial or least clear case of how to articulate the form of the skepticism in question. So I will start there too, with respect to my two forms for today. The first sort of skeptic I have in mind here asks a question like this: how can I know that things are as my senses present them as being? Is there really an external world? The form of the argument here is one, as I said, from a pair of indistinguishabilia, in which one member of the pair also, at least initially, suggests itself as a best case of knowledge. I'm having a certain experience. I'm standing in front of an audience in the Festsaal in Bonn, lecturing, conference on skepticism. But how can I know things are as my experience presents them as being? So while seeming to be, the lighting is fine and so forth, a best case of knowledge initially, the audience is at a reasonable distance for me to judge that they look like human beings, there still seems to be room, according to this sort of skeptic, for the question, how can I know that I'm not, in fact, say, lying undressed in my bed, dreaming that I'm lecturing? So the skeptical paradox, and this is where the best case is crucial to the unfolding of the form and how we go from the particular case to the general case, takes the form, if I don't know this, then how can I be said to know anything on the basis of the senses? Why should I ever trust what then gets called the testimony of the senses as such? Should I ever endorse the appearance which my senses present me? We could try to bring out what's characteristic of the form of this kind of problematic by saying it involves a particular kind of gap. The gap that figures in the first form, the one which the skeptic seeks to bridge, or challenges us to bridge, perhaps better said, is, in this case, from his mind to the outer world, from something that often gets called inner to something that gets called outer. The paradox lies in our apparent inability to answer the following question: how can I penetrate the veil of the inner or the sensory and attain a view of what's really happening outside of my mind? It's also a feature of this sort of skepticism, I think, that it invites a hankering for a third perspective, somehow outside both what gets called the inner and the outer here, so that we could compare them in the way in which Descartes' God should be able to, and can underwrite that they are, as it were, in harmony with one another, in a way in which we seem to require to underwrite the way in which we want to rely on what we have on the near side of the gap, while being stuck on the near side. The second sort of skeptic in this supposed area of philosophy is preoccupied by a question of a different form, I want to say. How can experience so much as be intelligibly of an external world? The form of argument here is not one which takes its point of departure from a pair of indistinguishabilia. We don't get two circumstances that are indistinguishable from a certain perspective to motivate this. And it's not at all important that one of the pair also appears to be a best case of knowledge. It can be quite an abstruse case, actually. Indeed, this form of skepticism can be motivated without, as it were, first having to isolate a certain kind of example. So the role of examples and the kind of examples you get in this kind of inquiry are different. Those are all further symptoms of the differences of form. When a Kant in the transcendental, in the first part of the transcendental analytic or in the deduction, or a C.I. Lewis, or a Wilfrid Sellars, or a John McDowell seeks to motivate this sort of skeptical worry, unlike when a Descartes or a Russell or a Thomson Clark seeks to motivate them, they don't begin by first starting with a tomato or sitting by the fireplace in a dressing gown or whatever, with what I call the best case of knowledge. Rather, they start doing something initially apparently quite irrelevant to the first skeptic's question, reflecting on something they're apt to call something like the respective contributions of the senses and the intellect in the constitution of our knowledge, starting to try to, as it were, characterize the different aspects of our cognitive capacity and ask something about how they stand with respect to one another. The skeptical problematic in this second form, thus, becomes focused on the problem of how, for example, to take one formulation one finds in the work of these thinkers, the senses is so much as able to furnish testimony, even false testimony. What sort of unity must experience possess in order to be able to present an appearance about which the question could arise? Shall I endorse it? Again, I'm not endorsing this formulation in my sense. I'm just reporting something one finds in philosophers who are concerned with the second form formulated this way. So the idea here in the second worry involves the question, how am I so much as able to enjoy an experience that possesses a determinate, world-directed content? Say that I am standing in front of an audience, whether it be a dreaming one or a veridical one. How can experience even do that? How can I even dream that? The skeptical paradox here lies, and it's coming to seem a mystery how what impinges on my senses could so much as appear to be revelatory of the world. So, to bring out the difference in form here, we might say we have a different sort of gap. The gap this skeptic challenges us to overcome is from sensory blindness to sensory consciousness, from a form of sensibility upon which things merely causally impinge, to one in which things are able to impress themselves to us as being thus and so. So, those are two cases of the first form. Two cases. One case of each of the first forms, God, I'm tired, differing with respect to their matter. So now we're going to look at these two forms again, varying the thing, as I say, one might be tempted to call the matter. We'll alter that while retaining the form. We'll do it a little more carefully than we might. We won't just take any case. We'll take one where, as we might put it, travel across each of these gaps is in the opposite direction. If we vary things that little, then I think it becomes easy to see we still have congruence of form. So now, in each case, we're not trying to go from mind to world, but world to mind. We're not trying to go from sensory blindness to sensory consciousness exactly either. So, the person before me, let's say it's Marcos Gabriel, is acting for all the world as if he's paying attention to my lecture. But I know he's very good at this while he's actually writing his next book. That's how he writes so much. Even if you look at him and talk, he doesn't even have to stop thinking about what he does, but he smiles a little bit. That's a reflex he's developed. So is he really paying attention? Or is he just doing what he does so well? The more common case of this problem is someone who's thrashing around in pain. And then do we say, do we really know he's in pain? Again, we have an argument from indistinguishability here. The case of pretending plays the role of dreaming in motivating the scenario of the indistinguishability. So we can ask in each case, is he really in pain or is he really paying attention? The paradox here takes, again, the form. If I can't know this about such an apparently best case, how can I ever be said to know what someone else is feeling, or whether they're even paying attention? The problematic here is focused on the problem, if you will, to keep the metaphor, problematic metaphor, I think, from before, of how to underwrite the testimony of the human body. The gap this skeptic seeks to bridge, as I put it, traveling in the other direction, is from the other's outer bodily movements to his inner states. This version of a skeptic asks, how can I penetrate the screen of the other's body and attain a view of what's really happening inside himself? And here again, some third perspective might seem ideal. They can compare what's going on in the inside and the outside. This version of what I've been calling the second sort of skeptic is again stuck with the question of, as I put it, a different form. His question is, how can the human body so much as seem to express a mental state? The paradox here lies in it coming to seem a mystery how an expanse of fleshy matter could even appear to have a meaning of a sort that's revelatory of an inner life. The problematic now is, to borrow a phrase from Wittgenstein, how the human body can so much as seem to furnish a picture of the human soul. The gap now that this second sort of skeptic challenges us to overcome is from an expressive, physical, or psychologically neutral locus of entities or entity to an animated field of human expression or thought. From something that has no psychological meaning, but is simply, as it were, in the realm of what Descartes calls res extensa, as opposed to something that comes into view, perhaps misleadingly, but nonetheless comes into view, as the communicative body of a palpably suffering, desiring, pondering human being. To speed things up a bit, I'm going to have to go fast. I'm sorry, because of my voice, I'm a little slow. Let's move to a third case of the two forms, philosophy of language. First version of the problem goes like this. How can I know that, as it's sometimes put, my interpretation of something is correct? So I, again, conceive of there being some merely physical, psychologically, in itself, an inert thing, a text, an utterance, a signpost. And I want to know how, in a second step, I can advance to an understanding of that that's correct. And this step, from the sign itself to an understanding of, is often called interpretation. That very notion of interpretation is something that acquires its meaning from a certain form of problematic. And then I can ask, how can I be sure that the interpretation I've assigned to it is what is really meant? I know how this sort of, say, signpost in the shape of a pointing arrow is usually to be interpreted, but it's easy to discuss, to construct a pair of indistinguishabilia here. Talk about how they do this in Japan, or whatever. And then I can ask, how do I know that my interpretation of this case is right here in Bonn, which is turning out to be a rather strange place too? And if I don't know this, how can I ever be said to know what something means? The gap the skeptic seeks to bridge here is between his understanding of the meaning of the sign, his understanding of the mere sign, as it's sometimes put, and what the sign actually means. So this version of the skeptic can ask a question that has this form. How can I, if you will, penetrate the penumbra, or the horizon, as it's sometimes called, of interpretations, and attain a view of the meaning itself? And someone might say, we can't do this for some special reason, which is, I think, to embrace skepticism in this area of philosophy, though in some quarters it counts as a truism to say that. The second sort of skeptic in this so-called area, again, I want to say, is preoccupied by a question of the different form. How can a sequence of marks or noises so much as seem to mean something? This is really the problem of Wittgenstein, which is often misunderstood for the first form of skepticism. The paradox now lies in its coming to seem a mystery how a mere sequence of dead signs could so much as appear to be alive with significance, how there could be anything that is breathing life into it, even wrongly. The problematic is now focused on the question, how does a linguistic performance acquire the physiognomy of an ostensible meaning? What sort of unity, to put it in Kantian terms, must it possess in order to be the sort of thing about which the question could then rise? Is this what it means? For it to be more than a mere blind play of signs. The gap the second sort of skeptic has to overcome, it's the same gap with the same form, I want to argue, third time around, is from a meaningless sequence of noises or marks to determinate expressions of thought, be they true or false. From semantically neutral concatenation of scratches or sounds to a legible field of intelligible meanings. Now, I claim, you can take me up on this in the discussion, I could go on and multiply pairs of examples of these two forms of skepticism from other areas of philosophy, indefinitely. Many such pairs. The foregoing, I actually give you 5 of each on the handout. Didn't know how much you could tolerate. But I'm going to take, if the purpose of the talk, since I'm running out of time, that these 3 pairs will suffice for giving you a preliminary overview of the 2 forms I'm seeking to isolate. And that brings me straight to the first form of philosophical insight, that I think a perspicuous overview of what I'm calling forms of skepticism can afford. It allows one to command a clear view of the relations of symmetry and asymmetry obtaining among variants within a single form. If one commands a clear view of the homology of form exhibited across the three variants of one of these forms just mentioned, then you put yourself in a position, on the one hand, to bring resources derived from the consideration of one of these variants to bear on another. And, on the other hand, if you really see the homology of form, you won't think that you suddenly can make progress in the one case where you couldn't with the other by simply changing the clothing of the problem without changing its form. And I say this because it's actually, I think, genuinely remarkable how many a philosopher today is clear, for example, that whatever else she wants to do in the philosophy of perception, she wants to reject the assumption that all perception of external objects requires an inference from how things seem to how things are. That's called a Cartesian gap. And she doesn't want that. And she realizes that she'll be saddled with such a gap, leaving her, as it's sometimes said, sealed inside her own mind, unable to claw her way back out to an unobstructed glimpse of, as it gets called, the external world. Well, this same philosopher, when she turns to, say, the philosophy of language, yields to the corresponding temptation without a pang, finding it utterly innocent to claim that all understanding presupposes interpretation in the aforementioned way of isolating this notion, thus saddling herself with a gap of, as I put it, of the same form. That is, leaving herself sealed within a horizon of so-called interpretations, unable to claw her way back to an unobstructed grasp of meaning. Now, I purported, when I first started to unpack the difference between these two forms of skepticism, to be offering various ways of contrasting something that gets vaguely put into place by saying, in the one case we're concerned with knowledge, in the other case we're concerned with an issue that centers on what gets called the conditions of knowledge. One thing, there's many things wrong with it, I think, but I think we can now see that one thing that's wrong with that way of putting the contrast is it makes it seem as if what were at issue in the first instance, in both cases, was a form of what gets called an epistemological worry. After all, if it's a skeptical problem, in the first instance, it's an epistemological problem, right? But if you'd been paying attention, it should already be evident from the foregoing there's much that's misleading in that idea. I do think it's constitutive of the first form that it be clothed in epistemological idiom. The focus in the first form always centers on knowledge claims. The point of departure for that form of worry is one that brings the relation between some range of knowledge claims and reality into question. What makes someone, if you will, a skeptic of the first sort is precisely that he's exercised by a doubt regarding whether we can have knowledge of such and such a sort. I think that's really only properly said in this strong way about that form, if we're using doubt in a certain philosophical sense. I don't think it's true of other forms, including my second form. We could talk about ancient skepticism in this regard if you want. But my first sort of skeptic is concerned with a doubt about whether we can have knowledge of material knowledge of Marcus's inner life, and so forth. Given the internal relation between the concepts of doubt and knowledge, this sort of skeptic is quite aptly characterized as someone who doubts. Because this kind of skepticism is the one we understand best in contemporary philosophy, other forms of skepticism tend to wind up getting shoehorned when we encounter them in this template. And that makes it hard to distinguish forms. But what figures in that first form as a worry about the relation between knowledge claims and reality comes to look, for example, from the vantage of the second form, like only, if you will, an instance of a much more general worry about the relation between any claim, true, false, or fantastic, and reality, in making a claim at all, whether or not one takes oneself to be knowledgeable. As I put it before, one makes oneself answerable to how things are. So the second form of inquiry in the philosophers I have in mind in the post-Kantian period tends to center on the question, how are you able to do that? That latter problematic is only optionally clothed in epistemological form. It is, at root, one that stretches to all sorts of... Sometimes this will be called semantic skepticism instead. But then again, it looks like there's a special issue about meaning that belongs to the philosophy of language. That I don't think is going to isolate the issue. The worry that exercises the second sort of skeptic is misunderstood, nevertheless, if it's taken to turn exclusively on matters having to do with knowledge. What comes into view, say, in Kant's own writings, under the initial heading of the conditions of the possibility of knowledge, are, if you will, the conditions of the possibility of mindedness as such. And Kant himself, even he with some frequency, alternates between characterizing the sort of conditions at issue here as conditions of the possibility of knowledge, as conditions of the possibility of experience, implying they're aptly characterized as conditions of the possibility of objectively valid knowledge, where these turn out also to be the conditions of the possibility of genuine sensory consciousness of an object. So, this second sort of skeptic is only inaptly characterized in the first instance as someone who suffers from a doubt. That misses what's distinctive about this form. And let me just register, that will seem to some philosophers to constitute a sufficient ground for now insisting that the thing that I'm calling the second sort of skeptic actually is not a skeptic at all. If his main problem isn't to doubt something, then why, Professor Conant, are you calling him a skeptic? So let me be clear on the following point as well. My aim is not to legislate how the word skeptic should be used, but only to illuminate some of the diverse ways in which philosophers, in fact, often use it, with the eventual aim of permitting the formulation of the following question: how are these problematics related? But I will claim parenthetically, if you insist that only the first form counts as skepticism, and anything else is a misuse of the word, then I think you'll have to conclude that a certain amount of the time, Kant and Hegel and Wittgenstein and Kripke and a lot of other people have thought and said interesting things about skepticism are misspeaking. What do I now really mean by saying the two skeptical worries differ with regard to their form? In the next part of the handout, I give you two sets of features which, if we went through them, if we had the time to do that, I think would allow us to unfold in considerably more detail what these differences in form come to. I don't have time to do that, but I thought I'd put them in the handout because I suspect in the discussion, if we want to press this further, it will be helpful to have those features in view. But by way of conclusion, I will just touch on what was the main form, the second form, or second kind, better not use the word form there, of philosophical insight that I think such an overview can give us. It's the one with which I began. I think such an overview can enable one to distinguish, as I put it, various sorts of verbal twins, and thus to distinguish some of the very different sorts of things philosophers take themselves to mean when they employ vocabulary. First of all, just vocabulary such as the words skeptic, skeptical paradox, skepticism, and so forth. But more importantly, it allows you to distinguish, as we might put it, which register, the first or the second, the philosopher in question is operating in. And that, I submit, this is what's really going on in these different cases of verbal twins, determines the manner in which a great deal of the rest of the philosophical terminology that is employed is inflected. I'll come back in a moment to what I mean by philosophical terminology. The thought here is the following. Equipped with the preceding overview of the features of these two forms that's in the part of the handout I just waved at, it becomes possible to survey, say, the history of 20th century analytic philosophy, to take one recent chapter. And notice that philosophers, in their discussions of what they call skepticism, often tend to be preoccupied with one of these two registers, at least initially to the exclusion of the other. And indeed, most of the mainstream of analytic philosophy over the first 3/4 of its century was largely obsessed with the first form. Moore, Russell, Broad, Ayer, Price, Chisholm, I could go on and on, are among the more distinguished members of what's called the first branch of the analytic tradition. But there's also a second branch of that tradition. It has fewer members. They've been active for the most part more recently, but I think it's no less distinguished, and it takes its initial point of departure almost entirely from the Fragestellung of the second form. It includes among its members C.I. Lewis, Wilfrid Sellars, Peter Strawson, Gareth Evans, John McDowell. If one examines, then, how what I called a moment ago, a great deal of the philosophical vocabulary, here's some instances of what I mean by philosophical vocabulary. Words like object, consciousness, experience, the given, direct, presence, epistemic, I could make this list much longer, is employed, one noticed that they acquire a different inflection in the writing of one of these, of the philosophers working one of these registers than the other. That's what the two sets of features is meant to bring out. And here, not only bits of vocabulary, but whole phrases, clauses, sentences, questions, indeed, whole paragraphs can be quoted and agreed with or disagreed with, while acquiring a different philosophical valence, depending upon whether they are inflected in accordance with the first form or the second, whether they occur in the context of the one or the other sort of philosophical investigation. Thus, for example, to come full circle, the question, can our cognitive powers reach all the way to the objects themselves, unquote, can express a skeptical anxiety of the first sort about the existence of the first form of gap between our representations of outer objects and those objects themselves, the anxiety being that our cognitive powers, as they're here called, always operate at an awkward remove from the objects they represent. This induces a certain sense of object, of material, forces a certain distinction between inner and outer, and so forth. Or those same words, that same question, can express a skeptical anxiety of the second sort, about our capacity to direct our thought at objects. The anxiety here is that our so-called cognitive powers are unable to furnish us with anything which even amounts to a so-called representation. Now, since the same form of words can, on a particular occasion, express either the first or the second worry, it becomes possible for two philosophers to take themselves to be in agreement with another when they are not, or to take themselves to be in disagreement with one another when they are not. And indeed, I want to suggest that Hilary Putnam, these are the last two quotations on your handout, stand in roughly the relation, Hilary Putnam stands to John McDowell's Mind and World in roughly the relation that the nomads do to Bertrand Russell's telegram. There too, we have a case of merely apparent agreement. The second to last item on your handout, I've given you two quotations from H.H. Price and C.I. Lewis. They are both from what is essentially the opening chapter of a book. These two books are written at almost the same moment in history. They both have basically the same title, The Given. And they're both trying to explain what the given is. And I want to say what they mean by the given is very different. Price is in the first problematic, Lewis in the second. But not only that, if you look at those two passages in your handout, you can start underlining. They have many other words in common: direct, presence, consciousness, object, and so forth. And all of those other words also acquire a different valence. If we want to distinguish what is form and matter in their problematic, the material object is what is outside of consciousness, which is only indirectly given, and so forth for Price. It's the real tomato. Whereas Lewis's example about a fountain pen is one in which both the things that Price distinguishes, what is vulnerable and what is invulnerable to doubt, both involve form and matter in his sense. And what he's interested in is the relation of sensibility to understanding in the constitution of an ostensible experience of a fountain pen. The issue is not its veridicality, but how it can have the meaning that it does, and what the role of the given element is in what he calls the given element, in constituting its meaning. The last two quotations, as I said, are from Putnam and McDowell. The first of them, the one from Putnam, is his expressing his agreement with McDowell, using the same words McDowell used. The second quotation gives you what I think McDowell's attitude to Putnam would be. If we ask them, it's actually from the preface of Mind and World, where I think he's distinguishing there, perhaps a little less carefully, the two forms of skepticism that interest me. And he said, so he has a particular view about the relation between these two forms of skepticism. He says, first is an inept and inchoate expression of a deeper underlying philosophical anxiety. That anxiety really becomes clear when it's turned into the second form. That's both a claim about the two forms, and actually in McDowell, I think also a claim about how to understand how Kant thinks the two forms is related and how Wittgenstein thinks the two forms are related, where in McDowell's reading they agree. Now, I don't agree with all the details of McDowell about this, but what I do cherish in McDowell is that that question comes into view, and he takes a stand on it. And that is the question whose interest, the importance of achieving clarity about, I have tried to urge on you today. Thank you.